The morning sun stretched its golden arms over Santa Rosa, California, bathing the quiet neighborhood in a soft, amber glow. The air was crisp but gentle, carrying the distant hum of a lawnmower and the occasional chirp of a blue jay perched atop an old oak tree. In the backyard of a modest, single-story home, Thomas "Tom" Calloway sat in his usual spot, a sturdy wooden chair near the porch, cradling a steaming cup of coffee in his weathered hands. The scent of freshly brewed coffee mixed with the subtle fragrance of lavender from the small garden his late wife had tended. At 67 years old, Tom had the build of a man who had spent his life in service, broad shoulders that had once carried the weight of burning beams, calloused hands that had pulled people from the depths of flames, and deep-set blue eyes that had seen both the best and worst of humanity. A retired firefighter, he had spent over 4 decades running toward danger, saving strangers, and standing as a pillar of strength for his community. But now, in the stillness of retirement, life had slowed to a quiet hum. Beside him, Maggie, his golden retriever, lay stretched out in the morning sun, her fur glistening like spun gold. She had been his wife's dog first, a gift from their children before she passed 5 years ago. Now, Maggie was his last tether to a life once full. She was his companion in solitude, his shadow on morning walks, and the only soul who never let him sit in silence for too long. As Tom lifted his cup to his lips, he closed his eyes, savoring the warmth. He had lived a full life, though loneliness had crept into the corners of it. Still, he was grateful for what he had, his home, his memories, and Maggie. Then, without warning, the world tilted. A sharp, blinding pain seared through his head, as if lightning had struck inside his skull. His right arm slackened, the coffee cup slipping from his fingers, shattering against the wooden deck. His vision blurred, and his body refused to respond. He tried to stand, to call for help, but the words caught in his throat, strangled by the sudden paralysis creeping through him. Maggie's head snapped up. She sensed something was wrong before he could even understand it himself. The moment Tom's body slumped to one side, she sprang to her feet, barking, a frantic, desperate sound that shattered the peaceful morning. The world around Tom dimmed. His breath came in uneven gasps. He tried to move, to reach out, but his body no longer obeyed. He was trapped inside himself. The last thing he saw before the darkness swallowed him was Maggie, standing over him, her brown eyes wide with fear, barking louder than she ever had before. Somewhere, distantly, a neighbor's door swung open. And then, everything went black. The world faded back into existence in fragments, blurry fluorescent lights overhead, the distant beeping of machines, and the sterile scent of antiseptic. Tom blinked, but even that felt sluggish, as if his body had forgotten how to respond. He tried to move, to sit up, but nothing happened. His right arm lay useless at his side. His legs felt as if they weren't even there. A quiet panic settled in his chest. Then, a voice, gentle but firm. "Mr. Calloway? You're at Santa Rosa Memorial Hospital. You've had a stroke." The words didn't make sense at first. Stroke? That happened to other people, older, frailier people. Not him. Not Tom Calloway, the firefighter who had once run up burning staircases without a second thought. Not the man who had spent his life rescuing others. How had he become the one needing to be saved? But reality settled in quickly, as unforgiving as fire. The doctor's face was kind but serious. They had done all they could, but the damage was done. The stroke had severely weakened the right side of his body, leaving him unable to walk, unable to hold so much as a fork in his dominant hand. The road to recovery would be long and uncertain. Tom barely heard the rest of the doctor's words. His mind had already retreated into itself, his thoughts looping over the same horrifying realization. I might never walk again. The days passed in a haze of hospital beds, therapy sessions, and the hollow ache of watching life go on without him. His children visited when they could, but both lived across the country, his daughter in New York, his son in Texas, and their own families kept them busy. They spoke with forced optimism, promising to check in, to call more often. But calls didn't fix what was broken. And then there was Maggie. She wasn't allowed in the hospital, but his neighbor, Mrs. Larson, sent pictures and videos. Maggie sat at the front door waiting for him, ears perked at every passing car, tail wagging hopefully at any sound resembling his voice. "She won't leave the door," Mrs. Larson had said over the phone one evening. "I think she's waiting for you to come home." Tom swallowed hard. He wasn't sure he would ever come home, not in the way Maggie expected. The hospital staff tried to encourage him. The therapists told him there was hope, that with effort and time, he might regain some mobility. But hope was a cruel thing when you had spent a lifetime being strong and now couldn't even pull yourself up in bed without assistance. He hated the weakness. He hated the helplessness. Most of all, he hated the thought of Maggie watching him like this, less of a man than he once was. The worst moment came 2 weeks in, when the therapist suggested moving to an assisted living facility. "We know this is hard," she said carefully, "but it's something to consider. Without full mobility, living alone will be difficult. And," she hesitated, "you may need to think about what's best for your dog, too." Something inside Tom snapped. No, his voice was hoarse from disuse, but there was steel in it. "I'm not giving her up." The therapist sighed. "I understand. But if you can't care for her, I will care for her." His grip on the wheelchair's armrest tightened. His body may have been failing him, but this, he would not lose. But deep down, he wasn't sure how. 3 weeks after the stroke, they sent him home. Not walking. Not whole. Just a broken man in a wheelchair, with a home that suddenly felt too big for him. The first thing he saw when they wheeled him inside was Maggie. She bolted toward him, tail wagging frantically, whimpering with excitement. When she reached his side, she stopped, head tilted, eyes searching his face, as if sensing something had changed. Her tail lowered slightly, unsure. Tom felt his chest tighten. "I know, girl," he murmured, running his good hand through her fur. "I'm different now." Maggie whined and nuzzled into him anyway. She didn't care if he wasn't the same. And for the first time since the stroke, Tom felt something other than despair. Maybe, just maybe, he wasn't entirely lost yet. The days turned into weeks, and the exercises grew harder. Linda introduced parallel bars to help Tom practice standing. He gritted his teeth through the pain, gripping the bars so tightly his knuckles turned white. His right leg trembled beneath him, weak and unreliable. The first time he tried, he collapsed back into his wheelchair almost immediately. "Damn it," he muttered, wiping sweat from his brow. Maggie, sitting a few feet away, whined softly before standing up and trotting toward him. She nudged his arm, her tail wagging ever so slightly. "She thinks you did great," Linda said, crouching beside Maggie and scratching her behind the ears. "And so do I." Tom exhaled sharply. "It doesn't feel great." "It never does in the beginning," Linda said. "But you stood. That's something." Tom looked down at Maggie, who was still watching him, her eyes filled with that unwavering trust. Maybe it was something. One afternoon, after weeks of slow but steady progress, Linda had another idea. "Let's take this outside." Tom frowned. Outside? You've been practicing standing, shifting weight, and gripping objects inside. But eventually, you're going to need to walk again. And I think Maggie might be the motivation you need. Tom didn't say anything. The idea of walking again felt like a distant dream. But he agreed, and Linda helped him out onto the porch, where Maggie waited eagerly. The California sun was warm on his skin, and the scent of freshly cut grass drifted through the air. Maggie stood at the bottom of the small ramp leading to the yard, her tail wagging, ears perked. "All right, let's try this," Linda said, adjusting the walker in front of him. "Just a few steps. Maggie will guide you." Tom swallowed, gripping the walker tightly. He shifted forward, placing his weight onto his left leg. His right foot, still sluggish and weak, hovered just above the wooden porch. He hesitated. Then Maggie whined softly and took a step forward herself. Tom moved his foot. It was just one step, shaky and slow, but it was a step nonetheless. Maggie's tail wagged furiously. She turned back to look at him, waiting. "You did it," Linda said, smiling wide. "One step." Tom let out a shaky breath. He hadn't walked in months. And now, even if it was just one step, it felt like something had shifted inside him. Maggie barked once, as if telling him she was ready for more. Tom tightened his grip on the walker. "Let's do another." The training continued, with Maggie becoming more than just a companion. She was part of the therapy. She would walk slightly ahead of him, her leash tied loosely around his wrist, encouraging him to keep moving. She learned to bring his cane when he was ready to practice standing, and even picked up small items he dropped so he wouldn't have to bend down. One evening, as the sun set over Santa Rosa, Tom sat on the porch without his wheelchair for the first time. Maggie lay beside him, her head resting on his knee. "You know," Tom murmured, scratching behind her ear, "I used to think you needed me." Maggie gave a sleepy sigh, nudging closer. Tom smiled faintly. "But I think it's the other way around." He let the words settle in the cool evening air. For the first time since the stroke, he believed, truly believed, that he was going to walk again. And he wasn't doing it for himself. He was doing it for her. The first time Tom made it from his porch to the mailbox, he almost gave up halfway. It wasn't far, just 20 feet, but for him, it might as well have been miles. His right leg, still weak and unreliable, wobbled beneath him. His grip on the walker was tight, his breathing heavy. Maggie walked just ahead of him, her leash tied loosely to his wrist, glancing back every few steps as if to say, "Come on, you can do this." Tom gritted his teeth and took another step. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the sidewalk. The mailbox, standing at the edge of his front yard, looked impossibly far away. He stopped, shifting his weight onto his good leg, and wiped the sweat from his brow. Maggie whined softly, stepping closer, resting her nose against his leg. Tom let out a slow breath. "All right, girl," he muttered. "We keep going." One more step. Then another. And before he knew it, he was there. His fingers trembled as he reached out and pulled the mailbox door open. Inside, just a few envelopes, bills, most likely, but to Tom, it felt like a trophy. Maggie wagged her tail, clearly sensing the significance of the moment. Tom swallowed hard. He hadn't walked this far since the stroke. He turned slowly, looking back toward the house. Now he had to make it back. The victories were small, but they added up. Each day, Tom pushed himself just a little harder. At first, it was just a few extra steps inside the house, walking from the couch to the kitchen without stopping, or standing long enough to make his own coffee. Then it became short walks outside with Maggie leading the way. Some days, he felt strong. Other days, he wanted to throw his cane across the room and scream. There were setbacks, moments where frustration swallowed him whole. One evening, after a long day of therapy, Tom was too exhausted to stand when he got home. He settled into his chair, feeling the familiar pull of despair creeping in. Maggie dropped her leash at his feet, wagging her tail expectantly. "Not today, girl," he murmured, closing his eyes. Maggie didn't move. She let out a soft, insistent whine, nudging his knee. Tom opened his eyes and sighed. "I said no, Maggie." But she didn't back down. Instead, she did something she had never done before. She grabbed his cane in her mouth and placed it in his lap. Tom stared at her. It was as if she was saying, "I know it's hard, but get up anyway." For a long moment, he didn't move. Then, he reached for the cane. Slowly, painfully, he pushed himself up to his feet. Maggie wagged her tail furiously, prancing in a small circle, overjoyed. Tom chuckled, shaking his head. "You're something else, you know that?" And just like that, he took another step forward. There were moments of joy, too. The first time Tom walked across his yard without his walker, he laughed so hard he had to sit down in the grass. The first time he managed to pour a full cup of coffee without spilling, he raised it like a toast to Maggie, who wagged her tail in approval. Each victory, no matter how small, felt like reclaiming a piece of himself. One afternoon, Tom decided to try something new. He clipped Maggie's leash to her harness, took a deep breath, and stepped outside without his cane. Maggie stayed close, matching his slow, deliberate steps. They walked past the mailbox, past the sidewalk, onto the quiet street. Halfway down the block, a neighbor, Mrs. Larson, called out from her porch. "Well, would you look at that," she said, beaming. Tom Calloway, walking without a cane. Tom grinned, even as he fought to keep his balance. Maggie gave a soft bark, as if she understood the moment was special. "Looks like your girl there's doing more for you than any doctor could," Mrs. Larson said. Tom nodded. She was right. Maggie hadn't just been his companion through this journey, she had been his reason to keep fighting. Then, one day, it happened. The moment that changed everything. It was late afternoon, the sun painting the sky in soft oranges and purples. Tom and Maggie had been walking in the park, a new milestone, one he never thought he'd reach. They stopped near a wooden bench, and Tom sat down to catch his breath. Maggie sat beside him, panting lightly, her head resting against his knee. And then, a child's scream. Tom's head snapped up. Across the park, a little boy, no older than 5, was standing too close to a steep hill, his small frame wobbling precariously at the edge. Tom's heart pounded. A woman, his mother, presumably, was running toward him, but she was too far away. And then, the child slipped. Before Tom could think, Maggie bolted. Her leash slipped from his fingers as she raced across the grass, faster than he had ever seen her move. She reached the boy just as he lost his balance, grabbing the back of his small jacket in her strong jaws and pulling him back. The boy fell backward onto the grass, safe. Tom stared, his breath caught in his throat. The mother reached them, scooping her son into her arms, sobbing with relief. "Oh my God," she whispered, looking at Maggie with pure gratitude. She saved him. Tom felt something shift inside him. For months, Maggie had been saving him. But now she had saved someone else, too. It wasn't just about his recovery anymore. This dog, this incredible, stubborn, loyal dog, had a gift. And for the first time, Tom wondered. What if she could help others the way she helped me? As he stood up, without his cane, without his walker, without even thinking about it, he knew one thing for certain. His journey wasn't over. It was just beginning. The story of Maggie's heroic rescue spread through Santa Rosa faster than Tom could have imagined. It started small, a few people at the park telling their friends, a neighbor stopping by to shake Tom's hand, a kind thank you letter from the boy's mother tucked into his mailbox. But within days, word traveled beyond their quiet neighborhood. The local newspaper ran a small feature on Maggie, calling her the dog with a hero's heart. Then, the calls started. A veterans group reached out, wanting to hear more about how Maggie had helped Tom through his recovery. A stroke rehabilitation center asked if Tom would come in and speak to other survivors, maybe even bring Maggie along. For the first time in a long time, Tom didn't hesitate. The first time he spoke in front of a group, he was nervous. It had been years since he'd stood in front of a crowd. But as he wheeled himself to the front of the small rehabilitation center auditorium, Maggie walking proudly beside him, every eye in the room was locked on her. Tom smiled. "Guess I know who the real star is." The crowd chuckled, but then they grew quiet as Tom told his story. How the stroke had taken everything from him. How he had felt like a shell of the man he used to be. And how Maggie, with her quiet, relentless love, had pulled him back, step by painful step. "She never gave up on me," Tom said, scratching behind Maggie's ear. "Not once. And trust me, there were days when I wanted to give up on myself." A woman in the front row, a fellow stroke survivor, wiped a tear from her cheek. Tom swallowed the lump in his throat and continued. "She didn't just help me walk again. She reminded me that I still had something to give." That's when Tom realized something. His story wasn't just his anymore. It belonged to every person in that room who had ever felt trapped in their own body, defeated, hopeless. It belonged to every person who had ever needed someone to believe in them, even when they couldn't believe in themselves. And Maggie, his stubborn, loving, life-saving dog, was living proof of what was possible. After that, things snowballed. The story made it onto local television. The anchor called it a tale of resilience, both human and canine. The next week, a therapist from a regional VA hospital called. "We think Maggie would make an incredible therapy dog," she said. "Would you be interested in training her?" Tom looked down at Maggie, who was resting her head on his foot, as if she already knew the answer. He chuckled. "I think we'd love that." And just like that, a new purpose was born. Months later, Tom and Maggie stood inside the VA hospital for their first official therapy visit. Tom no longer needed a wheelchair. He still walked with a cane on rougher days, but today, he walked in on his own. Maggie, wearing a bright red vest labeled Therapy Dog, stood proudly at his side. Together, they visited veterans recovering from injuries, PTSD, and strokes. They sat with men and women who had lost their sense of self, who felt abandoned by their own bodies, just as Tom once had. And Maggie worked her magic. She curled up beside patients, let them stroke her golden fur, rested her head on their laps as if whispering, "It's okay. You're not alone." For many of them, it was the first time they had smiled in weeks. And for Tom, it was the first time he truly felt whole again. He wasn't just surviving anymore. He was giving back. And all because one dog refused to let him stay down. If this story moved you, take a moment to share it with others, because sometimes, a simple story can inspire someone to keep going. Have you or a loved one ever experienced the life-changing bond of a therapy animal? Comment below and share your experiences. Your story could give hope to someone who needs it. And if you believe in the power of animals to heal, consider supporting therapy dog programs or local animal shelters. These incredible companions change lives every day, just like Maggie did for Tom. Because sometimes, the love of a four-legged friend is the greatest medicine of all.